Hey everyone and welcome back. Now in today's video we'll be discussing about the VPC endpoint services. Now let us go ahead and understand this with a simple use case. Now in lot of organizations they make use of a service providers like Datadog, New Relic for which the metrics are being sent. So for example, let's say that you have your own VPC. So this VPC belongs to your organization and you have another VPC of a service provider. Now what you will do from the set of EC2 instances, you send certain metrics. Metrics can be CPU utilization, it can be your application metrics and so on. So you send that matrix from your organization towards the service provider. And from the matrix that the service provider receives, they go ahead and they give you a nice little graph for which you can go ahead and investigate as well as inspect the overall latency or any other issues that are being faced for your organization's servers or applications. So this is a simple architecture. Now, one of the challenges with this type of architecture is that this matrix from the EC2 instance in your VPC is being sent to the EC2 instance in the VPC of a service provider over the internet. And one of the feature requests which lot of customers were requesting is that since the EC2 instance of both the consumer and the service provider are within the AWS environment itself, then instead of sending it over the internet, why not send it over the AWS internal network? This will not only save you cost, but it is much more secure and the entire connection remains private. Now, one of the approaches in which this can be achieved is with the help of VPC peering. Now VPC peering is great, but if a service provider has thousands of customers, VPC peering is something that cannot be looked upon. Primarily because let's take an example of there are two consumers, right? You have consumer 1, you have consumer 2. Now both of the consumer are using the same CIDR range, which is 172.31.00.16. So in such cases, the VPC peering will not work at the service provider side because there can be hundreds of consumers which are using the same CIDR range. So this approach is not possible. In case if a VPC peering approach was possible, then the entire connection was through the AWS private network only. So in order to overcome this specific challenge, AWS has introduced a feature of the service VPC endpoints. So what would happen in this type of architecture is that the EC2 instance would basically make use of an interface endpoint, and from the interface endpoint, the traffic goes to the network load balancer, and from the network load balancer, it goes to the set of instances of a service provider. So there are two important constructs here. One is the consumer and second is the service provider. So all the consumer needs to do is that a EC2 instance needs to send traffic to the interface endpoint. And now all the service provider they have to do is they have to create a load balancer, and this load balancer needs to be associated with a set of instances, and this interface endpoint would automatically send the traffic to this network load balancer, and this sending of traffic that is happening is via the AWS private network. It does not cross the internet, and this is the basic idea behind the service VPC endpoint. So let us do one thing. Let me quickly give you a demo so that this can be better understood. Now for today's video, I have two EC2 instances that are running. One is the consumer, which is the left hand side EC2 instance, and second is the service provider, which is the right hand side EC2 instance. Now we also have a network load balancer that is created, which is associated with the service provider EC2 instance. So if I'll quickly show you, let's go to the load balancer. So you see I already have a network load balancer that is created. So the right hand side part is already created and the traffic is automatically routed. Now discussing about the left hand sideways architecture, we already saw that a EC2 instance is created and we also have an interface endpoint created. So if you see over here, I have one interface endpoint that is created. So now as soon as the EC2 instance sends the traffic to the interface endpoint automatically sends the traffic to the network load balancer of the service provider. Now before we do that, let me quickly show you what exactly the instance at the service provider level is hosting. So let's go to the instance level. Let's open up the service provider instance. Let's copy the public IP. And if I paste it in the browser, it is basically a simple Apache based test page that is available. Alright. So now let's do one thing. Let's go to the consumer side instance and let's make a request to the VPC endpoint and see on how the traffic gets redirected. So I'll copy the consumer IP. Let's connect to the instance. And from here, let's go ahead and copy one of the DNS name associated with our interface endpoint. Let's do a curl on the DNS name, and as expected, you basically see this same page. So this is the test page in a HTML format, and you see it is basically the Apache HTTP server. Now the question that comes is, how does this network interface endpoint in a consumer VPC gets linked with a network load balancer in a service provider VPC? And that is through the service VPC endpoints. Now, if I'll go to the endpoint services over here, you should see that we have one endpoint service that is created, and within the endpoint connection, we have a VPC endpoint ID. So this is basically the endpoint ID. Let's copy this up. If we go to the endpoint over here, you see this endpoint. If I just paste this endpoint ID, you can see this is the interface endpoint. So what we first do is we go ahead and create an endpoint service. And this endpoint service is basically associated with a network load balancer. Alright, so we create an endpoint service in the service provider side. This endpoint service is associated with a network load balancer in the service provider side. Now we connect the interface endpoint to the endpoint services. So this endpoint service is associated with the interface endpoint. So anytime a traffic is sent to the network interface endpoint, it automatically goes to this endpoint service, which in turn is associated with a network load balancer. And from the network load balancer, the traffic goes to the EC2 instance. So this is how the service VPC endpoint based architecture works. Great. So I hope with this you understood the basics of the VPC endpoint services, and with this we'll conclude today's video.